To take something with a grain of salt is a common idiom in American English. If you take something with a grain of salt, it means that you do not take something that someone says seriously, or at least you are skeptical, you have doubt about what the person says. So if you take something with a grain of salt, that means you have some doubt about what someone says. So if you say something and I take it with a grain of salt, that means I question, I doubt. I'm not sure if what you're telling me is true or accurate or correct or not. I take many things I see on Facebook with a grain of salt, for example. Many times people post pictures with statements, and I want to look them up before I decide I believe they are true or not, so I take them with a grain of salt. Now, where does this expression come from? Well, the story of this idiom goes back nearly 2,000 years to ancient Rome, to the 1st century. Around the year 77 AD, so about 1950 years ago, in ancient Rome, there was a recipe. Now, many ancient leaders, not only in the West, in Rome, but also we know in China, Qin Shi Huang was also looking to protect from poison and even to extend his life. This is something that kings and rulers for a long time have wanted to protect themselves from poison. Well, this recipe to protect you from poison included a grain of salt. And it was said that if you included a grain of salt, it made this remedy, this protection, easier to go down. When you swallow it, when you put it in, the salt makes it easier to swallow. Perhaps because something in the poison remedy or the antidote didn't go down so well, didn't taste so good or whatever. So the idea was the grain of salt made it easier for you to put it down, to kind of accept it. Well, it didn't come into the English language at that time. Of course, there was no English language at that time. Yeah, they spoke Latin in Rome. But by the 17th century, in Europe, studying the classics of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, especially in England, was a very important part of being considered an educated man or woman. You had to know the Roman and Greek classics, and if you could use Latin or ancient Greek, that was considered the mark of an educated person. Well, because of that, this recipe came up. And in the 17th century, someone came up and the phrase entered the English language, meaning that the truthfulness of a statement should be seriously questioned. So someone says something, I question what they say. I don't take it seriously. And that was the attitude of the day. The attitude of that era, especially starting in the late 17th century going into the 18th century, it was an era of philosophy in England and France and other parts of Europe where we questioned everything. It was an age of skepticism in which we questioned everything around us. So this phrase, this idiom that had its origins in ancient Rome but came into the English language in the 17th century was a product of the beginnings of an age in which we were skeptical about everything. So it fits the day that it entered into the English language. So it makes it easier to accept when someone doesn't keep their word, or when someone says something and it turns out that you can't really believe what they said because it turns out what they said wasn't accurate. So if you have a little bit of skepticism about it, a little bit of doubt about it when they tell it to you, then you can accept it more when you find out that it's not right. If you believe it blindly and then you find that it's not right, well, that can be much more damaging, much more harmful to you. That was the idea in the 17th century, in the philosophy of the day. Let's look at some examples of modern 21st century uses of a grain of salt. Many people take what the president says with a grain of salt. Now, let's be honest, this is not limited to any one state. I'm not pointing anyone out here. But you have a president, whether it be Ma or Obama or Hollande or whomever, and many people take what the president says with a grain of salt. They don't believe everything he says without double-checking, triple-checking, or more. So many people take what the president says with a grain of salt. Okay? As a question, should we take what Kim Jong-un says with a grain of salt? Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. Should we take what he says with a grain of salt? Or when someone gives a statistic, it is wise to take it with a grain of salt. Sadly, in debates and in arguments, people kind of make up statistics as they go along. So maybe we should take the statistic with a grain of salt. This has been an entry of the history of idioms and words in the English language. If you have any more questions about English, please check my Facebook page or my YouTube channel. 如果你还有英文问题，你可以看我的 FB 台中新英格兰美语，你也可以看 YouTube TCNE English。如果你在台中，你要找英文老师，你可以用 FB 跟我联络。谢谢你收看。